Recently, some 2,800 secret government files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy were released by President Trump. But Mr. Trump delayed releasing 300 other files after last-minute appeals from the CIA and FBI, citing irreversible harm to national security if he were to allow all the records out now. So, we now seem to have at least as many new questions about the Kennedy assassination as we have answers. I'm joined now by forensic pathologist Ceril Wecht, a longtime critic of the Warren Commission and its finding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing Kennedy on November 22, 1963. In 1972, Dr. Wecht was the first civilian given permission to examine the Warren Commission's evidence at the National Archives. Ceril Wecht, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
So in 1992, following the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK, President George H.W. Bush signed into law the requirement that all documents related to the Kennedy assassination be released within 25 years, unless the president says doing so would harm intelligence, law enforcement, military operations, or foreign relations. And that's what President Trump did on the recent 25th anniversary of that law. He said he would release everything, and then at the last minute, he held some documents back. So the full record will be kept from the public for at least 6 months. Why do you suppose he did that?
Why did Trump change his mind sometime in the evening of Wednesday, October 25th into the early morning hours? Who knows with Trump at any given moment what will happen. I have no explanation except one that is purely conjecture, but I think is highly likely. It's like Sherlock Holmes said to Watson, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the answer. I think that it was a eye-to-eye contact between Trump and the CIA, and finally then probably the CIA said, okay, fine, and back off a little bit, and Trump did them a favor, and maybe down the line they'll consider doing him some little favor also. What other explanation can there be? Remember that this is something that has been talked about, that has been contemplated, that has been in place, as you've pointed out, for 25 years. And let's bring it up to the recent time, for the few weeks, months just preceding the scheduled date of release. What possible new thing could have come to their attention? That's number one. Number two, after 54 years, what possible harm could there be to our relationships with any government, with any policy, anywhere in the world, when you go with the Warren Commission scenario? The Warren Commission report, I remind people, says that Lee Harvey Oswald did everything from beginning to end. So I don't want to hear any ands, ifs, buts, moreovers, howevers, what ifs. You know, you're pregnant, you're not pregnant. You go with the Warren Commission, nobody else is involved. So I would like to hear from anybody, the most astute, knowledgeable person, or engage in wild conjecture with regard to our clandestine, surreptitious agencies, CIA and FBI, and who knows what else is out there. I want them to explain how, after more than a half a century, the release of these documents having to do with one guy, Oswald, whoever he was, whatever he did, how can that harm anybody today? How can that compromise? How can that be in any way something that we have to be concerned with?
Unless it's something so perceived as so horrifying to the American public.
Well, thank you.
which obviously you've suspected all along.
Thank you. There's the answer. Why do you withhold these 200-300 documents? And by the way, we don't know how many pages there are. You know, it could be tens of thousands of pages. So it's not just a matter of 200, 300 pages. It's a matter of thousands and tens of thousands of papers. Why were they withheld? It has to be because they are potentially harmful to our government, some governmental agencies. They have to be something that would be horrifying, as you've said, to the American public. That's what it has to be. And it is time to deal with that. Remember this, it was quickly ascertained after the assassination on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, that it wasn't the Russians, it wasn't the Chinese, and it wasn't the Cubans. There was that wonderful comic strip character named Pogo, a possum, a long time ago. I remember that great line, "We have met the enemy and he is us." So they ascertained this was something that happened in our country that was effectuated by Americans, whoever they were and whatever their reasons were, and we can talk about that. So now the focus was here, and the decision was made that this is too horrifying, too cataclysmic, too potentially catastrophic. You don't know what it would lead to. Remember, these were very, very tumultuous times in America, both internally, domestically, and internationally. Here, Kennedy was talking about voting rights and civil rights and other policies. He was
and
talking
possibly abandoning the plan in Vietnam.
Very good, withdrawing from Vietnam. And he was really teed off about that Bay of Pigs debacle. He was in a session, this is documented, with Senator Mike Mansfield, I think then Majority Leader, and he had a piece of paper like this, and he tore it up into pieces like we do. He threw it into the air and he said, "This is what I intend to do to the CIA."
Well, and of course, the Bay of Pigs, the invasion of Cuba, was a plan that he inherited apparently from the Eisenhower administration.
Yes, that's right. Remember, the other point to keep in mind, the CIA was an independent entity. They really answered to nobody. They did what they wanted to do. And whenever they thought that there was something out there that was dangerous to America, they would just act. They were responsible for the overthrow, for the assassinations of leaders around the world. Allende in Chile, Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran, the Diem brothers in Vietnam. Anything that the CIA wanted to do, they did. And these people, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, I'm not suggesting some massive cabal, some big joint meeting, maybe a couple of military leaders. I personally believe that there probably weren't more than 3 or 4 people that made the decision to eliminate Kennedy. And then from there on, it was, need to know, and you do this and you do that. But they weren't going to sit back, you see, and wait 5 more years of John Kennedy. He could not be beaten at the polls. He was up for re-election in '64, followed by 8 years of Bobby Kennedy, and that was going to happen too before Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. So for these people who saw America going to hell in a basket, these super patriots, when the flag is flying and the Star-Spangled Banner is being sung, they see and hear something that regular folks like you and I, just plain old American citizens, we don't fully comprehend. We don't really understand what is essential and necessary for America. So what do? How do you deal with that when you cannot, in a democratic society like ours, overthrow that government? There's only one way, and that's through the physical elimination of the president. That is what happened on that day.
There's Lee Harvey Oswald, who famously said, "I'm just the patsy." Well, he ends up being the guy that is accused. Unfortunately for the United States and the world, it never went to trial because Jack Ruby assassinated him days later, which of course makes it even more suspicious. How does Lee Harvey Oswald, unsuspecting communist sympathizer, end up becoming the patsy?
I think in the documents that have been withheld, that continue to be sequestered, I believe that there are things dealing with Oswald and his relationship with the CIA. I can think of nothing else that has the smallest amount of potential logic and rationale and applicability of a significant, meaningful nature at this time. There was Oswald stationed at Atsugi Air Base in Japan. He had a significant clearance. That was a very important base. So he applies for a discharge based upon his mother's medical needs. His mother had bruised her nose at work and missed 1 day of work. Oswald got out of the U.S. Marines on that basis. I was in the Air Force for 2 years. I was involved very much in trying to get somebody discharged on a medical matter and so on. I have some knowledge. I was a medical officer and so on. You don't just walk in and say, "Hey, my mother needs me," okay? So he gets cleared. He's back in America, and in no time at all, he's he's leaving. And he goes to Russia. He's there for more than 2 years. He's denied membership in the Communist Party. He gets a job. He meets Marina, who is the niece of a KGB colonel, and comes back to America. He was never extensively interrogated and vetted after 2.5 years. Let me tell you, in 1973, I and a few professional colleagues went to Russia for a professional meeting with forensic pathologists in Moscow and Leningrad. I wasn't home for 2-3 days before 2 FBI agents came to my office. They were courteous and nice, and they wanted to talk about Russia. What did I see? What did I think? And so on. They weren't questioning me or my colleagues what we did, but they really wanted to know. They were interested in learning. What did we observe?
Because this was 1973,
exactly,
middle of the Cold War.
But a guy who lived there for 2.5 years, married to the niece of a high-ranking Secret Service official, their KGB, they have no great interest in Oswald. Think about it. And then he comes back, by the way, and he's here and he's there, and he's distributing leaflets in New Orleans, fair play for Cuba. Then he's in Mexico at the consulate. Come on, give me a break. This just reeks of that kind of super spook activity.
What kind of connections do we know or can we reasonably assume existed between the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald, as far as you're concerned?
Well, I believe that Oswald was some kind of a CIA agent. I'm sure they have different kinds of agency, I don't know, and so on. And he was being used and set up. Now, from the very beginning, I'm not suggesting that this was a plot going back years about how we're going to eventually wind up killing Kennedy. No. But as things evolved with Oswald, then began to work out. Remember this, that you don't put a plan like this into place unless you're prepared to deal with it and provide an explanation to the American public. And it fitted in with Oswald getting that job at the Texas School Book Depository, et cetera, et cetera. So my succinct answer to your question is, I think there was a definite relationship. I think that Oswald was, in some fashion, to some degree, in varying ways and different times, an agent, a provocateur with the CIA. And that is what they are fearful of. That's what they are concerned about if these documents were to be released.
So they're going to review the documents for at least 6 months.
They're supposed to get back to the National Archivist by, mid-March, and tell the archivist in detail what it is that would be harmful. Trump says he'll then review it, and by mid-April, he'll make his decision. Obviously.
Do you think they'll ever be released, or at least in a non-redacted form?
I would like to say yes, and yet intellectual honesty, as depressing as it may be, indicates to me that they're going to continue to try and withhold documents as much as they can. And then who knows what documents have been destroyed? Who knows what is gone? Remember this, as you mentioned in passing before with your historical summary, Oswald was assassinated. Going back to that, that was essential. That was necessary. There's no way in the world.
Necessary to shut him up?
There's no way in the world they were going to have a trial. Look at Jack Ruby. Just to finish up with Jack Ruby. He was mafia at the age of 17. Jacob Rubenstein there in Chicago, okay? He's now down in Dallas. He's a restaurant owner. He's a bar owner. He's a pimp. He smuggles guns into Cuba. He's a police informant. He's an FBI informant. Damon Runyon on LSD could not have created the character of Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, according to the Warren Commission, he's down there sending money via Western Union to a former stripper of his on a Sunday morning. And he says, you know what? I had nothing better to do. Oh, look, there's the police station. I'll just walk down there. Nobody questions him. Nobody asks anything. He walks in, and sure enough, out comes Oswald, flanked by these two big non-uniformed police officers. He takes out his gun, and he decides there's no way that Jackie Kennedy can be put through the horrifying travails of a trial, and I'm going to eliminate Oswald. And then Jack Ruby, later on, this is documented, when Warren and a couple of members of the Warren Commission, including Gerald Ford and others, were there at the police station in Dallas. He went down on bended knee and he pled with them to take him to Washington so that he could give them testimony and talk, and they declined. To believe that Jack Ruby, and by the way, it's been shown and proven that he did not just walk down that ramp, that he was led in by a high-ranking official through a security door and so on. I mean, the whole thing just stinks to high heaven. So the elimination of Oswald alone tells you something, and I have information from somebody who was a #1 legal confidant and attorney to H.L. Hunt about some shenanigans that were going on there at that time in Texas about payment to somebody to check out the security at the police station, to what degree was Oswald being protected and so on. And then we wind up with Jack Ruby with the mafia connections. It's all there.
So did Jack Ruby's mafia, does his mafia involvement prove that there is a mafia connection to this?
Oh, I think there's a mafia connection subsequently to clean up certain acts. You know, there were all kinds of suspicious, unexpected, unexplained deaths. London Times did a study on this, and they came up with those number of deaths. I've forgotten that number. A very large number of people, you know, involved with some degree of involvement with the assassination and so on, dying under those circumstances, their ages, etc., and the odds were in the tens of millions of people. Okay, I think that the mafia, the answer to your question is the mafia came to be involved.
The motive being that the Kennedys were cracking down on organized crime, that may have been their reason for...
Yes, the mafia would have been happy to be involved, absolutely. But the people who believe that the mafia orchestrated this and they were primarily and solely responsible, no way in the world. First of all, if the mafia did that by themselves, they wouldn't have the kind of overall protective shield and the ability to do all of these things. Number two, where were they going with that? If it ever came out, my God, it would have been impossible. Any long-time Italian-American citizen in this country would have been fearful of his life. And number three, that would have still left Bobby Kennedy around, right? Mm-hmm. He was their most bitter enemy. So the mafia was used later on. Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, yeah, they played roles, there's no question, including Jack Ruby and other things that are quite inexplicable in terms of people's deaths.
In August of 1972, you were the first civilian forensic pathologist given permission to examine the Warren Commission's evidence at the National Archives. Yes. What was in there?
In 1965, April, they came up with this cockamamie written document from Jacqueline Kennedy giving, as from her personal property, all these materials in the homicide case: the clothing, the gun, the bullets, the x-rays, everything. They were considered to be her personal property, which is sheer nonsense. I say she was the last person in the world, I'm sure, that would have ever wanted to ever see or touch or have possession of those materials. Why did they do that? So that they could have this personal gift, with the caveat that nobody could see these things for 75 years, with the exception that after 5 years, quote, a pathologist with a serious historical purpose could request and possibly then gain access. Now, a year and a half later, in October of 1966, the government people, including two of the doctors from the autopsy, went in and they did an inventory on her gift quotation marks, from April of 65. Okay, so that's in place. Now, I go in August of 72 and I see the materials and I'm looking and I see then these two documents, April 65, October 66, and guess what? A large metal box containing the brain and a few microscopic slides that you examine, and some photos and x-rays are no longer there.
The president's brain.
The president's brain is missing. 45 years later, the president's brain is unaccounted for. Now the Warren Commission, self-appointed supporters and sycophants, they'll say, oh, the Kennedys took it and buried it or so on. There is no documentation of that at all. At no time has any member of the Kennedy family simply stated that. They would have had a right to do that if they wanted to, yes. And some people do these things, return tissues to the grave of the decedent's body. But there is no indication of that. And through all those years, with all of these discussions about the president's brain, you can be sure that it had to be painful and distressing to Caroline Kennedy and John when he was alive, and to Bobby for some years, and Ted Kennedy. How come nobody ever simply said, yes, we took the brain and we buried it, end of the story? Never happened. That brain is missing. Why? Because when you examine the brain, you can tell then the trajectory of the shots. The fresh brain is as much a dense liquid as it is a solid. It has the consistency of a well-done soft-boiled egg. You cannot examine the brain, especially to see a hemorrhagic tract of a bullet or so on, clearly in that fresh state when it's been damaged. You place the brain in formalin. That's a fixative solution which hardens the brain. 2 weeks later, you go back, the brain now has the consistency of a hard-boiled egg. I don't mean to be crude, but people have to understand what I'm talking about. And just like a hard-boiled egg, you can make slices then, and each slice is definitive and clear-cut. And with that kind of parallel sectioning of the brain, you are therefore able to examine the brain and see how did the bullet go. When you go back to the autopsy report, you will see, as I learned in the late fall of 1964, when I went to the Carnegie Library to prepare for my presentation at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, scheduled for February 1965 in Chicago, which is how I got started in this whole business, invited to represent the pathology section. I went there. 26 volumes had been acquired by the Carnegie Library from the Warren Commission. No index. Finally, I found what I was looking for, and there it is. In the autopsy report, you will see the pathologist put the brain in formalin, went back 2 weeks later to examine it, and then here is the quote: serial sections, parallel sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Preserve the specimen? For whom? For whom? That's why the brain was not examined, because examination of the brain would have immediately proven scientifically and unequivocally that the president was struck in the head twice, one from the rear and one with a shot from the right front coming from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, which fits in with what you see on the Zapruder film, fits in with the crowd. Everybody, you've seen those pictures, everybody running up there when the shots were fired, fits in with the acoustical evidence that was studied by Bolt, Baranik, and Newman in Boston, Weiss and Kanaji, two professors at Queens College. That acoustical evidence was primarily responsible for the House Select Committee on Assassinations 1977 to 79, then issuing their final report saying that there was most probably a conspiracy.
Sounds of a shot, yes, or shots being fired.
In the way they came from two very prominent independent non-governmental agencies. It is all there. And that's why that committee, and remember, established the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and I was a member of that forensic pathology panel. There were several panels that were established. And that distinguished committee, Republicans, Democrats, a nonpartisan, bipartisan committee, they concluded that there was a conspiracy. And so here we sit, you have an official determination made by the United States Congress, by a committee set up for that very purpose, to reinvestigate JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King's assassinations, respectively, coming up with that conclusion, and nothing was done from 1979.
And you're saying that by having the president's brain, you can examine the trajectory of the bullet, and you have always been of the school of thought that there's no way, based on your knowledge of how the president was wounded, where he was struck, that Lee Harvey Oswald could have inflicted those wounds by himself with that weapon from where he was perched?
First of all, when the cars come into Dealey Plaza there in downtown Dallas, a presidential limousine, when they turn from Main Street, take a right-hand turn on Houston, as Houston Street comes in, then you're coming closer and closer to the Texas School Book Depository building with a clear shot, no tree branches or anything. Oswald doesn't shoot then. He waits for the cars to turn. Now they're going away from him, moving downward and to the left. Tree branches sporadically block your view, and then he shoots. And he has a weapon, a Manica Carcano, a non-automatic bolt-action weapon considered by all long gun experts as the most inferior weapon of its genre developed anywhere in the world. Nowhere is it a bigger laughingstock than in Italy, where it was developed, considered to be an instrument of love, not a weapon of war. That's what they call it over there. I learned when I did some programs in Italy many years ago. And then he shoots. They tried to duplicate that later on. And you see, that was the problem that they were confronted with. The Zapruder film, taken by Abraham Zapruder, a women's clothing merchant,
the most commonly viewed
exactly.
color,
right.
What was it, 8mm film footage?
8mm film.
President.
And for young people, they don't know what they were the spool of film, and they were comprised of individual frames, and you put them inside a camera.
It's a home movie camera.
On sprockets. Yes, okay. All right. So the camera was inspected by Eastman Kodak and by the FBI, and it was determined that 18.3 frames moved through the camera per second. 18.3 frames. And then in the meantime, the weapon was fired by the best marksman the government could find, and they determined, without worrying about accuracy and repositioning at a moving target, that it took 2.3 seconds to shoot, unload, and shoot again. 2.3 seconds. And that was a seemingly impossible physical incongruity when you match the two up, because the Zapruder film clearly shows Connally being hit 1.5 seconds after Kennedy is hit. And that is what gave birth to the single bullet theory. Arlen Specter, junior legal counsel then on the Warren Commission, would have loved to have been there that day as they were confronted with this horrible problem. Oswald's now dead. It's been announced to the world officially by Hoover and everybody that Oswald did all of this alone and so on. How can that be? And that is what gave birth to the single bullet theory, said Arlen Specter, and the commission eagerly accepted it. What if one bullet made 7 wounds in 2 men? The one bullet went into Kennedy's back, came out his neck, went through Connally's back, perforated the right lung, destroyed 4 inches of the right 5th rib, exited from the front of his chest, re-entered the back of his right wrist, shattered the distal end of the radius, one of the 2 long bones from the elbow to the wrist, exited from the front of the wrist, and then went into his left thigh. 7 wounds in 2 men. That is the saga of the pristine bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, the hero of the single bullet theory, which Mark Lane and I and others dubbed a long time ago as the magic bullet. I can tell you about that pathway moving to the right and left and up and down.
Well, let me ask you this. Where do you think a second shooter would have been, or other shots would have come from?
There's no question in my mind, and the proof, as I've said, in terms of the study of the brain, the radiological studies, the neurological, pathological studies, what the doctors at Parkland Hospital saw, by the way, and that's documented in a film that will be released later this month called The Parkland Doctors, in which 8 doctors who took care of Kennedy, along with others in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital that day, are interviewed on this documentary called The Parkland Doctors. Look for it. And they describe damage to the back of the head, which the doctors who did the autopsy that night did not describe. The president's body moves backward and to the left. Blood and brain spatter so far back onto the motorcycle policeman riding behind the left rear tire. He was certain for seconds that he had been shot. All of those things together prove that a shot came from there. There is a shot from the rear. Now, whether it was Oswald from that southeast corner, 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository or elsewhere, that's a subject for another day. But I don't even have to go down that road. As I always say, you want Oswald as a shooter? Fine. My involvement in this is not the exculpation of Lee Harvey Oswald. my involvement, my concern, my dedication for all these years has to do with proving there were two shooters. What is the significance of that? When two people are involved in the perpetration and the planning, the execution of a criminal act, that makes it a conspiracy under federal laws and the laws of every state. And when you have that conspiracy, you got a second person, you have to reinvestigate, you have to follow through. And that is what they did not want to do then, and that is what they do not want to do today because of where it will take them. That's what the whole thing is all about. You know, before you get to all these questions about Oswald, and they're important and they're interesting, and I'm fascinated by them. Who was he? The CIA. But before you get to that, you have to show that the shooting, the fatal injuries of Kennedy, the wounding of Connally, you have to prove that they were fired by one person from one site. You have to prove that to begin with.
And you've just never bought that.
If you don't have that, then before you go anywhere else, you know, that's the end of it. Then you know that you've got a conspiracy. And that is the whole cockamamie idea of the single bullet theory, which they have to live with. They're stuck with that.
What does the U.S. government think, in your opinion, that will panic people or disturb people about what might be in those files?
Well, let me answer it this way. Do a poll, go outside on the street right now, anywhere in America, take a poll. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, whether you love or hate Trump, whether you love or hate Hillary Clinton, take a poll. What do you think about the honesty of the American government? What do you think about the efficiency of the government, Congress and the executive branch and so on, okay? Pretty low, isn't it, okay? Now, if it comes out at this time with what's going on with America, in our country, and our relationships with the rest of the world, if it were to come out even now today that our government or our people, some Americans at high levels, were responsible for the assassination of the president, for the overthrow of the government, for coup d'etat in America, which is what it was, how will that impact? What will people think and believe about the U.S. government?
But aren't we, if you ask most people out on the street today, do you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone? Most of them will say no.
That's right.
Okay,
that's right.
So
and consistently
aren't we ready? Aren't we? In 1963, probably most people wanted to believe that it was this one crazy guy, and most people in 1963 would say we trust the U.S. government. You certainly wouldn't hear that today, as you stated. And you also have people who are skeptical about the magic bullet theory, about Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. So why not aren't people ready to hear the truth?
The problem with you and me is we're just plain ordinary folks. We're bright, we're educated, we're intellectuals. We'll give ourselves
You are
credit.
for sure.
No, and so are you. I mean that, okay? Our problem is that we don't think like these people do. I know people say, how come nothing has come out, and so on and so forth. It's impossible. I'm not suggesting that I have full comprehension, but I do know this, that these people, and look at the oaths they take and the way they function and so on. And I'm not talking about Democrats, Republicans under all administration. These people, they live in a world of their own, lying, BSing, engaging in any kind of manipulation. This is what they do. See, Americans are naive. Oh, that's what the KGB, NKVD, that's what the Tonton Makuti did in Haiti, that's what the secret agencies do from Israel and England and France and so on. But not us. We're Americans. We don't do those kinds of things. We do the same kinds of rotten, horrible, malevolent things. That's the nature of these agencies. And the people that run them, I'm not suggesting they go around killing people willy-nilly. They do what they have to do. They're protecting our country. They're making sure that things are done that ordinary folks can't do, that cannot be accomplished in a democratic fashion, that cannot be accomplished through the UN or international relationships or discussions. That's what they do. That is their purpose. That is their raison d'etre. That is what they're all about. And it's impossible for plain folks like you and I, no matter how educated, how bright we think we are, to understand. We don't think that way. They get these people, they love that Northeastern, Yale, Harvard crowd up there, and so on. That's the nature of the beast. And that's what it's all about, and still today. And to expose this now, it would not lead to maybe a revolution such as might have happened back then. I mean, who knows what might have happened. Think of what happened when Martin Luther King was assassinated on the streets. What would have happened? What was going on in America at that time? Who knows what would have happened? Today, I agree with you. It would be horrifying. It would be turbulent and very, very distressing, but not likely to lead to that kind of street violence 54 years later. But would it lead to even more rejection, more non-acceptance, more disgust, disapproval of the government and what it stands for and so on? Absolutely. And I believe that that is a main reason why these materials are being withheld even to this day. But it is time to put it out there. And I just want to say this, that to the Warren Commission supporters, and they are the minority, we're not the minority, the conspiratorial buffs, as they denigratingly refer to us. We are in the majority. We've been in the majority since the first polls started in 1967-68 to the present time. We are the majority. Those people, including the major news media like the New York Times and the Washington Post that continue to support the Warren Commission, they should be the leaders. They should be editorializing those newspapers. They should be leading the charge for the release of all the documents. They should be saying, hey, let's show all those critic researchers, Wecht and his colleagues and all those other people, let us show what fools they are, what buffoons and conspiratorial nuts they are. So they should be leading the charge for the release of all those documents. Where are they? Why aren't they doing this? Look today. My God, nothing can be kept secret. You run for office, you're involved in politics. Look what comes out. Did you pinch a cheerleader's rear end in high school? Did you smoke pot when you were in college? Did you change your underwear? What did you have for lunch? And so on. Look at the people being forced out of office or not running for re-election with this or that or so on. Isn't that fascinating? But now, when we talk about something that is really important, like the assassination of a president, now we have this secrecy. We can't talk about it, but we can talk about everything else that is of no great significance or importance. We can force people to resign and leave their positions and so on because of some trivial nonsense. We can prevent many young, wonderful people from going into politics because who wants to have their whole life put on display? Who doesn't have something that they're maybe a little ashamed of or embarrassed by or so on? That's the point we are. But on Kennedy assassination, we still have this cloak. We still have this veil. We still have this impenetrable shroud of secrecy, and that cannot be tolerated. It cannot be accepted.
Dr. Ceril Wecht is a world-renowned forensic pathologist who has never accepted the results of the Warren Commission, which stated that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone when he assassinated President John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. Dr. Wecht, it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you so
you,
much
sir.
for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.